Hospital Porter's Pride and Dignity. Stop the New World Order. Welcome to Hapanwo TV. Welcome to this. It's a follow-up video, actually. It's actually a follow-up video that we've been promising to do for a very, very long time. Now, if you remember, it's back in July, actually, I made two videos on the subject of free will. One was just about introduction to the subject, and the second was a live stream where I took live questions about the whole thing. Now, I promised to come back to this. Other things got in the way, obviously, as they do, but I did want to come back to this, not least because there was a lot of debate and a lot of contention among my viewers about this sort of thing. Indeed, I'm going to go through some of the comments that were left on the video, which I didn't cover in my comments reply video because they're so specialised to this particular subject. But also, one of the people I think is involved in this is one of the people I think really took an interest in this and really took it to heart and decided to put her own position in to try and resolve the issue is Cosmic Claire. Cosmic Claire is Claire Ray Randall, who is a great thinker and philosopher, and she has a blog called Waking the Monkey. She's got a book called Waking the Monkey. She's coming out with another book very soon. There's lots of videos with her, lots of interviews with her online, and so I was very interested to hear what she had to say about this. Very interested indeed. And she actually sent me the draft of an article she's working on, which she hasn't managed to publish yet, but she wanted me to read it and to possibly to use it in the video so we have some idea about what's going on, and it puts an additional input into what I was discussing with you guys. And I think, having read the article, I'll go through it bit by bit, it has changed my position somewhat. It's very interesting. It's called... I'll go through this article, then I'll go through some of the comments that were left by other people. I want to say thanks very much to Claire Ray Randall for writing this, and I really appreciate her input. You know, the way she has really got involved in this particular issue to try and resolve it, and her insight actually, I think, is very... I think he's actually pretty decisive when it comes to this particular subject, unless, of course, I know that I'm going to get some comments disagreeing with that. I look forward to them. But I wanted to say thank you very much to Claire for that. I'm now going to go through this particular article. Now, it's called Misapplied Question. And she said, "Hi, Ben." She was in the form of a letter. She's going to turn into an article. "I watched your video on free will and determinism, on the free will and determinism debate, and I thought I should make a comment on it. You covered the conventional arguments, but these are subject to certain logical fallacies, which I will detail. The first one is that the debate is almost always approached from the materialist causality level, and so leads to a foregone conclusion. This is a version of the 'have you stopped beating your wife yet' fallacy." All right, so the "have you stopped beating your wife yet" fallacy it's basically an ethical contradiction. It's a proposal with no contradiction. So in other words, you can't really there's no defense against that particular axiom. You say, "Have you stopped beating your wife yet?" That means you're a wife beater, but have you stopped it yet? I mean, you're bad either way. Whether you say yes or no, you're a bad person. You're slightly better if you say yes, because you can say you stop beating your wife. If you say no, you're even worse. So it's a choice between bad and worse. So this is similar. So Claire has identified something of what we were talking about, which is similar to that. Laplace's demon is effectively a statement that foregone conclusion by couching everything in terms of the determinist universe from a point of view of classical mechanics and so forth. Now, I'll come back to Laplace's demon because there's some new research done into that, which is very interesting. I'll come up to that in the end. Laplace's demon is a thought experiment by Henri Laplace, I think his name was. I'll just look it up. Pierre-Simon Marquis de Laplace, that's right. I can't keep saying Laplace, but it is Laplace, yeah. It's just a habit now. I've got used to calling it that. But it's an imaginary entity that knows everything in the universe. It knows every single point in the universe, and also knows all the forces acting on that point, and therefore can work out all the rest of eternity. the job of predicting the rest of eternity is simply a matter of doing the sums. It can predict everything. And it's a statement of foregone conclusion, which it is, because the determinist universe has Laplace's demon in the sense, well, it's either random or it has Laplace's demon, but the determinists essentially say, well, everything's determined, but everything's random at the same time. And well, I'll come back to that because it is indeed random, but it's possible that Laplace's demon could never exist. I'll come back to that. And from the point of view of classical mechanics, that is, Newtonian mechanics. The idea of Laplace's demon actually came from basically Newton, the discovery of Isaac Newton, who basically invented the whole idea of modern physics. She continues, as Claire says, I do not contend the mechanistic argument because the solution to this is outside that, and it is a lost battle before it even starts. Well, yeah, you see, this is kind of where what I was dealing with in the first video and in the live stream, because the conventional explanations I have for free will is, well, free will exists because even in a mechanistic universe, because of dualism, because of the fact that we have a brain, and the brain is mechanism, of course. We know that it's essentially an electrical machine. It's a very sophisticated computer. But we have outside of that a soul, a non-material entity, which kind of controls everything. It controls. It's basically the hard problem. What you are, your own consciousness, and the decisions you make, comes from that non-physical entity. It's something that can't actually be detected or seen, but it is said to exist. Now, of course, many scientists and philosophers denied that it even exists. They've said that they've gone and looked into the brain, thinking, well, we'll find it inside the brain. This thing which people say is outside the brain, the soul or the consciousness outside the brain. Neuroscientists through the 20th century said, well, we'll find it within the brain. They went and looked in the brain, and they couldn't find it. So that led to what's called the hard problem of consciousness. Now, the problem with that is that if you say, well, okay, there is a soul, it's outside the brain, and that's where free will comes from, you've got to say, well, what is the mechanism of the soul then? How does that work? And how is that any different from the brain? Whatever mechanism it operates within the etheric realms or heaven or whatever it is, it has to have some kind of mechanism. And therefore, where does the consciousness of that mechanism come from? You get an infinite regress. It's called the homunculus, the ghost in the machine. The little guy inside watching it's called the Cartesian theatre, it's also called as well. And this essentially creates a problem of infinite regress, because every time you suggest a cause for free will, someone comes along and just pushes it back a notch. And Claire says this is a lost battle before it even starts, and I think this is what she means by that in this article. Claire continues. The next step is that the very term free will needs to be unpacked before we can go any further. We all know, or at least think we know, what is meant by determinism, but there's very little consideration for what we mean when we talk about free will. Yeah, determinism is that everything actually happens is essentially out of our hands. It's either random or it's the product of some kind of physical system. Now, I'm going to go into it says Laplace's demon is the one who knows everything about that physical system. So, because we know that, random matter is actually organized. We know that. There's random, apparently, random matter or supposedly soulless matter does organize itself into structures, stars, planets, rocks, life forms. But now, according to the idea of determinism, this is all mechanism, and in a sense, our brains are a part of that mechanism. Therefore, our thoughts, feelings, and consciousness is a part of that mechanism too. Now, either it's random, or it's completely and utterly, or it's part of some kind of physical mechanism we don't yet understand. But there's certainly nothing free about it. Either way, it's something separate from us that we can't control. Well, Claire continues. What do we mean when we talk about free will? There are at least three directions of consideration from this. One, absolute random and chance, that's right. Two, ethical imperative. Or three, sole causality outside of physical mechanics. And again, that is sort of leading on to the what controls the soul, homunculus, infinite regress argument. But Claire actually surprised me here, because she does come up to something. She does come up with something very interesting, which shines light onto that issue. Claire says, the first one to deal with is the question of what would a free choice be? You rightly, addressing me now, you rightly drew attention to the perpetual regress of the homunculus all the way down, which is used to justify determinism. This is all right as far as it goes, but it is posed only as an alternative to a free will, which is completely undetermined. But how can something be completely undetermined? I didn't understand this at first, but I didn't understand this particular sentence, but then Claire carries on. If our actions don't come from some reason, they must be entirely random, like how we understand quantum physics. That is entirety without meaning. This is why I introduced the term reason as distinct from cause. Causes are mechanical processes, reasons are psychological. Yeah. I see a cause would be, for example, a physical system which generates consciousness. Yeah, whereas something random essentially couldn't, because the bumping of random atoms, such as in a jar full of air, you have atoms of gas within that air. Air is a mixture of gases. That's never going to produce consciousness, because it's a completely random, homogeneous, just collection of objects. Yet a physical system, for example, a whirlpool, which is, it's not actually a thing, but it's a process which creates a shape, something which has a place in space and time. It's recognizable. So a whirlpool is kind of like an example of a physical system, which is not necessarily conscious, but it exists. It has organization. So she says, this is why I introduced the term reason as distinct from cause. Causal mechanisms are reason. Causes are mechanical processes. Reasons are psychological. And I'm getting it now. Yeah, it's something somewhere is making us do things other than just randomly with a purpose, or either randomly without a purpose, or deterministically with a purpose caused by a non-conscious physical system. And she carries on. I think this probably has some bearing on Molyneux's willingness to argue for free will, even though he's an atheist materialist. That could be. It did kind of trigger some memories of the debate Molyneux had. I can't find it. He's got so much bump on his channel. I can't find the actual show. He did a debate with a determinist, which is interesting. It is something like that. Yeah. Claire carries on. Actual free will, if it does exist, or if there is any meaning that can be extracted from the term, must involve some kind of meaning being present in the actions that people consider freely chosen. So, meaning in a sense, so this is something more than just, this is actually a product of consciousness in a sense. Meaning is a product of consciousness. I think that's what she means here. The alternatives are complete material determinism, which reduce consciousness and the hard problem to mere epiphenomena. Yeah, well, that is now the issue. I'll just finish this sentence here. Or else completely random and meaningless choices like the dice man. Now, these are two separate issues in a sense, but they're connected, and I agree. The hard problem of consciousness is separate from the free will issue, although Claire will explain how that it's connected, and I agree there is a connection to it. So it's worth just going into it, even though essentially you can deal with the hard problem of consciousness separately to free will. However, the current understanding, Daniel Dennett, I talked in the previous video. I will put links in the description box, and please do go watch the previous two videos if possible, if you're new to this issue. But Daniel Dennett suggests that there's no hard problem of consciousness. It doesn't exist because it's been misdefined, because there is essentially nothing. What we call consciousness actually doesn't exist. As Anthony Peake puts it very wittily, well, who writes his books then? Yeah, and that's actually that kind of issue is far easier to demolish. It's far easier to debunk than the determinism. I'll tell you. The opposition to the hard problem is simply it's essentially people who have an ideological commitment to materialism, faced with some facts, which means that their position is untenable, so they therefore come up with essentially a fantasy. A bit like Remainers. Hey, Claire? Um, anyway, Claire carries on. I don't accept any argument which refuses to acknowledge the really hard nature of the hard problem. No, neither should anybody, because it is probably the biggest. It's probably one of the most difficult conundra in science right now, which is how does the mechanism of the brain, which determines, there's no doubt that if you touch something, your brain lights up. If you feel pain, your brain lights up. If somebody does something to your brain, harms it in some way, or even puts an electric current through it, you get different thoughts and feelings coming into you. You have it can change your behaviour. It can make you move your limbs. Some can actually make you raise and lower your hands simply by pressing different parts of your brain with a needle. So the idea is that in some way that the sense of being, qualia, this sense that you exist, self-awareness is another part of that, and somewhere inside your brain there's this thing they call the I module, which basically creates that particular feeling in exactly the same way. They can't find it. They can't find it anywhere. So no, you should never deal with anything that just ignores the hard problem, that tries to brush it under the carpet the way Dennis has done. Claire carries on. In fact, I think the answer lies in accepting the hard problem as part of the solution, as I shall explain. This is interesting. The next stage of my case is that what I want to lay out is the ethical imperative. It is rightly observed that by many that determinism voids ethical responsibility. Yeah, this is very interesting, because the ethical imperative is, as you know, in this pseudo-psychopathic culture we live in, it's something that the powers that be, the Illuminati, trying to drum out of people. Even though it exists, it exists in humans. And it even exists in non-human animals as well. They have many non-human animals have a sense of right and wrong. So yeah, but it's surprising how many people you meet everyone day and they say, yeah, it's a dog-eat-dog world out there, man. It's survival of the fittest. Charles, you know all about that, don't you? She says this is a very serious matter. The social consequences of the two competing belief systems are quite obvious and dramatic. Yeah. And this is I think we'll go through this again. I think Claire kind of repeats a point I made, but we'll go through it again because it's very important. I can't really give her a voice because I don't know. I only give voices to people I take the piss out of and I don't respect. I would like at this stage to pose an alternative label for what has been up to now called free will, ethical responsibility. Absolute determinism voids responsibility, while free will accepts and engages with it. If one can claim that all your behaviours are the result of external forces, and that you can do nothing about them yourself through choice, agency, or taking any kind of responsibility, then you can get away without taking any blame for the most atrocious actions, as you described with some of the serial killers you mentioned. Yeah. It is a very serious matter. People say, well, we can still put people in jail, can't we? We can still punish them. Well, no, you can't. The whole concept of punishment within the law, in terms of sentencing in criminal law, would have to be amended. Criminal law would have to be turned on its head, which means that the only purpose of prisons, for example, would be to put dangerous people away from the rest of the population. Now, that is one of the purposes of prisons right now. But prisons have two purposes. Firstly, to take people who are dangerous to others and separate them, basically put them into a confinement so they're not free to interact with others and therefore harm them. But also to punish them for what they've done, to say, look, you've done a bad thing and we're going to put you in a place where your life is not going to be very nice. You're going to eat porridge and you're going you're going to sleep on a bunk bed, and things like that, and you're going to have a bucket in your cell to have a crap in, things like that. If criminal would have to be, if the people are really going to take determinism seriously, criminal law will have to be determined. Prisons would have to be turned into internment camps, like the ones in World War II. The United States built prison camps in California for the Japanese population there, and they moved them all into these camps. They were actually quite nice. I mean, I don't approve of that. I think that was a bad thing to do. But the camps themselves were not prisons. They had normal houses, and they had normal amenities. They had shops, and they had parks, and they had football pitches, and others like those in another country I could talk about, but I won't, because, well, you know, it's more than just getting a video banned if I do that. But basically, this was not intended to punish the Japanese American population. It was not them saying, well, you committed a crime. It was saying, because this is war, we need to separate you from the rest of the population. So we're going to put you into these internment facilities, which are not, the punishment element is not there. So life is pretty much the same as it is outside, except you're not free to leave. You have to stay within it. So it is obviously it's not ideal, and of course I know President Clinton apologized to the Japanese Californians for that particular purpose. However, you know, you understand the difference. There is a difference between a prison intended as punishment and internment, and a facility that is just intended for internment. You would have to amend the law so that all prisons would simply be for internment only. And it is a very serious matter, actually. Yeah, and if this is not being done in criminal law, if solicitors are not getting together now and doing that, then maybe it's because they don't really believe in determinism. I'll carry on now. So there's clearly this is Claire again. So there is clearly a very different set of outcomes between the two types of belief systems, which is an interesting fact, since the determinists claim that everything is determined. Yeah, as I said, you would have to change prisons completely. But those who accept that at some level they have the choice to take responsibility produce a more satisfactory outcome. Now, this is like everything the atheoskeptics come up with. Yeah. For some reason, what I mean by satisfactory is it seems more functional, it seems to work better, it seems to fit better, it seems to be more pleasant. Which, for example, if someone harms me, I get angry with them, and I'd like to see them punished, not just kept away, but to be punished. And see, if you believe in determinism, you can never have that. If you believe in free will, you can. If you believe in free will, you can have that satisfaction. You have the satisfaction of knowing the person who harmed you, the criminal who stole your handbag or did whatever they did, is now away from you for at least a number of years. They're away from you. You're safe from them for at least possibly permanently, depending on the severity of the crime. But also, they're now in a position where their life is going to be miserable because of what they've done. And everything that atheoskeptics come up with is like this. For example, the afterlife and things like that. It's like, but I mean, I can't help thinking the atheoskeptics have a kind of almost sadomasochistic element to themselves, because they're drawn to these various outcomes which are less satisfactory. You know, this is I think that with denying the afterlife is maybe this is the sort of MBA thing I go on about. You know, MBA. You know, there's videos I did about that. If you've been watching, I don't have time to explain now, but look at my Peter Fenwick video, for example. Okay, Claire continues, one that is probabilistically more functional. That's a concept you're going to come across a lot in the book, by the way. Now, Claire's talking about the book she's writing right now, which is actually, Claire, I believe it's going to be published soon, isn't it? I know that I think Arctos are going to bring it out at some point. You haven't given me, I don't think I'm saying anything that's confidential, but you're going to get. I know that Arctos are publishing it at some point soon. I think is it December? I don't know. Now that's interesting, Claire says. Something of a paradox that a false belief would produce a more functional outcome. Yeah. So belief in free will, the false belief, produces a more functional outcome, would it not be if hard materialist determinism is actually the case, something of paradox that a false belief would produce a more functional outcome? Would it not be if hard materialist determinism is actually the case? Which I would suggest it is not. But also bear in mind that the determinist is nonetheless making a choice when he claims that his actions are determined and that he can do no other. Now this is what triggered something within my memory, wherever my memory is stored within the quantum tubules of my brain. Whatever mechanism retrieves it, it actually went into the right tubule and pulled it all out. Because this is what Monads said in his video. He said something like, in this particular thing he did, this show that I can't find now, where he had this debate, he put it, well, look, who is choosing to make you realize you have no choice? This is kind of the paradox. This is the paradox of determinism. The very fact that determinists can say what they even conceptualize their lack of choice kind of denies the very concept they're trying to propose. It's very likely it's similar to lots of others, like similar to what Anthony Peake said to Daniel Dennett, who writes your books. Then, in a sense, Peake is saying there's no consciousness, but who's making him say it? He's something within him, some non-conscious part of him, has conceptualized the idea that he doesn't exist. It's a paradox, yeah. Claire continues. Yet the one believing in ethical responsibility is also making a choice which is more congruent with their belief. Yeah, so you have, if you believe in ethical responsibility and free will, which what Claire's obviously redefined these terms, it seems to be just simply more logical. You have fewer, in a sense, to use the skeptic's term about Occam's razor and parsimony, you have fewer rational hoops to jump through to make it fit with reality. It's the simplest outcome to the question. The simplest outcome tends to be the right one, yeah. And belief in free will and ethical responsibility fits better. It just fits easier. It's a downhill run to a conclusion that fits with reality. Whereas if you deny it, it's an uphill struggle to get to a conclusion that fits in with what you see as reality, to make it resemble something involving reality. So yeah, it just feels it's an easier route, which makes one believe, according to Occam's razor, that it's correct. Claire continues. So now we reach what I have referred to as soul causality. You go into this and say that it is woo, which is a tacit submission to the materialist paradigm. I shouldn't have used that terminology, Claire, I agree. Claire continues, nearly every culture and civilization in recorded history has held beliefs about the soul, the afterlife, animism, and so forth. And I contend that calling this woo is a serious and unnecessary concession at a conceptual level which isn't justified. Oh, Claire, you are so polite to me. I think you wanted to be harsher on me there. I do. Yeah, I mean, woo is actually a skeptic term. I don't know why I used it. I can't remember exactly why I used it. You see, I believe what you said about the soul. I actually believe that these things are objectively real: the soul, the afterlife, animism, etc. I think my point was that it cannot explain refill because of the homunculus infinite regress. But I know you've actually shed some light onto that. So yeah, that was the point I was making. I using the term "woo" was the wrong term. Anyway, here we go. She carries on. Addressing the eternal regress, homunculi all the way down, we get to the real nitty-gritty, the soul and consciousness and the hard problem. The fallacy here is to treat the soul as simply another mechanism which is caused to act according to the influences upon it. But that is not the case. Firstly, it is non-material. That's not quite an explanation, but she will provide one. The materialists claim that consciousness, they won't acknowledge the soul, so we have to go with consciousness, is simply an epiphenomenon or byproduct of the electrochemical fields created by the neurons, is merely an assumption. It has never been proved, and the reason why is because of the hard problem. There is no proven mechanical causal link between brain processes and consciousness because they are different ontological categories. There literally cannot be a simple causal link. There may be associated patterns, but correlation does not equal causality. This is not merely an assumption, but a known fact of psychology. Yeah, I would add I would add onto that. Claire says psychology. I would add onto that anatomy. Claire says, and the basis for superstition and gambling addictions amongst other things. The brain draws patterns from experience, but they can't be wrong. Right. That's what I was saying earlier. You know, during the 20th century, they literally went into all through the 20th century. They went into everything. They picked apart the inside of your head, looking for that eye module, along with not just for that. I mean, they were looking basically to find out how the brain worked. They wanted to know, well, how does this pound of flesh inside your head basically govern all your physical functions? And in fact, they worked out that yes, it does. They worked out the brain actually does. Different parts of the brain do different things. The vision is processed at the back of the head. There's all the sense organs processing positions are in different parts of the brain. There's the frontal lobes, temporal lobes, occipital lobes, etc. They worked that out. They did some excellent work. What they can't, they even found out, the thoughts. They even can actually trace. They can't read every single thought you have, but by using a PET scanner, they can work out kind of what you're thinking. So if you think about a certain subject, different parts of your brain will light up than what if you think about another subject, which means they can't exactly read your thoughts yet, but they know roughly the kinds of things you're thinking about. So that's a bit scary, actually. I mean, the possibility for the abuse of that technology for political reasons is very, very worrying. But that's not the point for this particular video. The point is that nowhere can they find a place where those thoughts came from. They can't find some kind of source for it using a PET scanner or any other medical sensor. Now, Claire is actually getting there. However, that's really about the hard problem of consciousness and basically she's explaining how the soul has to be non-material, and we know it's non-material simply because it can't be detected, but I believe it can be demonstrated to exist. Claire continues. We need to have recourse to Sheldrake's morphic fields at this stage. Oh, good old Rupert Sheldrake. Yeah, he's an interesting chap. He proposes that the world is made up of countless interacting fields. Our consciousness is a field, and when it is functioning optimally, it recognizes structure and meaning in its perceptual field. Meaning simply cannot be reduced to nothing more than a set of material causal events. What would that even mean? Yeah, so that's kind of like meaning is we learn from things, so we learn from experience. This is almost like Pavlovian stuff, I think most animal species and some plants indeed retain experience in memory and then adjust their behavior following that according to what they've learned. But you see, that's almost a sense an automatic process. There's no kind of contemplation of meaning from any of that. It's almost like automatic. The cat will sit on your lap when it wants feeding because it knows that will get you to feed it. That's a Pavlovian response caused by experience. The cat remembers the last time it did that and then adjusts its behavior in the future to get what it wants from you. Children do that as well. It's pester power, But that's not meaning. That's a set of material causal events. It's not meaning. Meaning, and Claire continues, meaning is an imperative field in consciousness. The imperative is something that makes you do something. Yeah, a Gestalt. Now, trust the Germans, eh? Whenever we don't have a word, the Germans give us one, because German is a weird language. Actually, it's one of the most difficult languages to translate exactly into English. The Japanese is another, apparently. It has many words which don't have an exact meaning in English, which is why we borrowed words such as Schadenfreude and Gestalt. A Gestalt is something that is made of many parts, yet is somehow more than or different from the combination. That's what it means, a Gestalt. I know that crafty nihilists are a Gestalt entity, as you know if you follow them. That's Mark and Liz. Our rational minds, says Claire, are always trying to reduce everything to simple causality, which is why we find the free will paradox so confounding. Yeah, but if there are larger consciousness fields involved, then it is a lateral and holistic phenomenon rather than a linear causal sequence that determinism holds to be the case. Right, so we are looking at something which, and Claire's going to explain a little bit more about the intersection with the universe. But it's lateral, meaning that it goes sideways rather than up and down, if you know what I mean. So rather from past to future, it may be something that is drawn from the present, and indeed, she'll explain more a bit in a minute. But this is kind of where you get into this. I think this is where the debate has been so far. There's been an attempt to try and explain free will using the linear arguments, like where does it come from? How is it generated from the past, or from lower forms of matter, or indeed from lower, souls which exists beyond it and then influenced it, that kind of thing. This is the point that I have to try and explain very carefully, because the reductionist Laplace demon in our own mind wants to try and reduce it to linear causality. Consciousness is a field which integrates and interprets meaning, like Leibniz's Monads did this. Now, Carl Leibniz was not Carl Leibniz, somebody Leibniz. He was a philosopher who came up with this idea of monadism. I did read a brief description of it. Now, it's quite complicated, but it reminds me very much of Ken Wilber and his holons. Now, I don't know if you're familiar with Ken Wilber. He's a metaphysical cosmologist, along with other things, and he talks about holons. Now, holons is everything is a holon. Everything in itself is made up of parts. Yet the holon is also a part of something else, and he talks about something called a holarchy. Which is very interesting, because he goes on to explain in more detail about things such as the creative nature of matter. I mean, I referred to Ken Wilber in my video about evolution. Do you remember I went to see Professor Lennox at the town hall in Oxford? John Lennox, the really good guy, a really amazing guy he is. And we talk about and then it led on to a discussion about evolution. That kind of the birds, you get these creatures which are like dinosaurs. And they have like normal jaws with teeth, and they don't have a wishbone. And then suddenly this thing emerges with feathers and a beak and a wishbone. And then there's things in between which have wishbones but no beaks, or beaks with no wishbones, or feathers with no wishbones or beaks, and things like this. But they don't seem to. These birds don't seem to really to evolve in the Darwinian sense. And Wilber describes that as the creative nature of matter. Yeah, it's a very interesting thing, which I go into more detail in that particular video. I can't keep putting links in the description box. But the monad, when I read up about monads, I mean, Claire will correct me if I'm wrong here, but it reminded me very much of Ken Wilber and his holons, the holarchy. She carries on. Each is a unique point of view, which is reflected back to the rest of the universe. This is why every soul is unique. There is something to be learned from every point of view. Consciousness could be described as orthogonal to material reality. Orthogonal meaning that it's kind of at right angles. It intersects, but is somehow perpendicular to it. But there is that point of intersection. How do the two interact? They are ontologically different, but they intersect. They have some things in common, but are not identical. Yeah, this is the thing. This is what mechanism does something non-material influence the material? It's something that has been thought about for a while. I mean, they even before they could find ways of reading your brain, they would say, well, how come your thoughts can create things in your body? I mean, they can make you sexually aroused. They can cause the fight or flight mechanism. Yet the thoughts aren't things. How do they do that? How do things which can't be detected, even with a PET scanner, cause these sort of things to happen? By what mechanism does that happen? I mean, they've worked out there's something to do with peptides. These are chemicals that come from your brain as a result of its processes, and then do affect your body. However, is there a certain thing which also can do that with your soul, with your consciousness? Does your consciousness do the same thing somehow? And if so, how? Claire says, consciousness or the soul are not linear, causally created things in the way that a brain is, and reasons while they have feature in common with material causes, are not the same and cannot be reduced to them. Well, no, of course not. A cause essentially is unconscious, a meaning is conscious. In fact, I'm kind of putting words in her mouth because Claire's going to explain here. Meaning is not something that is materially caused. It is something that only exists in consciousness, which, as we have established, is not reducible. These may seem like fine points, but this is the business of philosophy. To wrinkle out the distinctions in order to have a better understanding. So consciousness is at least to some degree outside simple material causality as generally understood. Well, yeah, I mean, if it wasn't, then we'd find some way to be able to perceive it. I mean, there are some neuroscientists hanging on to hope. They're just saying, well, look, Susan Blackmore said this. She said, we will find this one day when we understand more about the brain, how the brain works. We still haven't solved all its mysteries, and the eye module is still hiding away there in some dark corner. But many others are now saying, I mean, the whole purpose of Dennett's kind of like denial of consciousness comes from neuroscientists who said, well, look, I don't think we're going to find this. And so they can either accept that consciousness exists, but is in a sense spiritual, or they can say, well, there is no consciousness. So which are they going to choose, you think? If you're an atheoskeptic with an ideologically committed to material or atheoskeptico-materialism, or you're invested in your MBA for social reasons, which are you going to choose? Where are we now? Where was I? Sorry. And yet it has ways, and it's to some degree outside simple material causality, as is generally understood, and yet it has some way of working which makes it function so as to be able to respond to meaning, which is an imperative field in consciousness. What we need to do now is consider and examine how consciousness, or perhaps the soul, behave outside of strict conditions of material causality, while doing our best to avoid slipping back into a materialist causal paradigm. Consciousness is indivisible and irreducible. It cannot be deconstructed into constituent parts. Now, this is where some will interpret me as conceding to determinism, but it is more subtle than that. I didn't quite detect that myself, Claire, but I think the idea that something that is indivisible and irreducible then cannot be, in a sense, it controls everything. I think that's what she means. And that the imperative in the field of consciousness perhaps is the determinism. No, I mean, actually she goes into more details in that in a minute, I think, if I remember rightly. I did read through this originally. Returning to the argument from ethical responsibility, at higher level ethical decisions, the higher level ethical decisions, which are what we are really concerned about here, rather than simple behaviours which may be reduced, are arrived at through a gestalting of meaning derived from the holistic reflection, rather like Leibniz's monads. Yeah, the holarchy and holon of Ken Wilber comes from the term holistic. It's related to that word etymologically. Claire says here that it's a holistic reflection. Yeah. The gestalting, that is something that is made up of many things, but is more than just the sum of its parts. A monad is an entelechy, as Leibniz calls it, something which brings form to potential. Right, so you could say something that brings form to potential. So something which is not there yet, but then can become something. It could be a thought, an idea, a feeling, which doesn't yet exist, but then is brought into form. Yeah. The actualization of form-giving cause, as contrasted with potential existence. Yeah. This is something that form-giving cause, which would be, for example, I don't know, some heat, something hot which melts ice is giving. It's a cause of ice melting, for example. Yeah, as contrasted with potential existence, that would be keeping the ice away from the flame so it doesn't melt. I think that's kind of what we're talking about here. In other words, a point of consciousness that brings meaning into existence. Right, so this would be, again, which she's talking about the soul as it's functioning outside at the moment, materialism. So this would be the potential. The soul outside the material would be the potential. The soul intersecting with it would be bringing meaning into that existence. I think I'm getting it now, yeah. Thus, the argument is that there are inherent qualities within the nature of the consciousness, soul or monad, I would say also holon, which are uncaused, at least in the material sense, since they are present in that thing which is itself uncaused, at least in the physical sense. So like in the ice before it's melted. Yeah, that's just an analogy. Yeah. This is the hard problem. Consciousness is uncaused in terms of material causality, since it is not a material thing. This is the ontological paradox we basically face. So this, I think, is where the hard problem connects with the free will problem. Because if we have something we know exists, but we can't see it and can't detect it, we know it's there. Where's it coming from? And that is the essence of the hard problem. This is the consciousness is uncaused in terms of material causality. This is not a material thing. This is the ontological paradox we basically face. Excuse me. The term entelechy that Leibniz used derives from the Greek telos, purpose, fulfillment, or meaning, from which we get teleology, the study of explanation by meaning, not Newtonian causes. In other words, Newton explains how things work, how matter interacts with itself without any sort of meaning behind it. It's just different forces, one force acts on another, but there's no meaning to that. Even within very, very complex physical systems, such as a star, for example, which is a nuclear fusion, or all right, Hugo Rune, I know, or whatever causes it. You have a kind of that's very, very it's a very complicated physical system. Whether it's conscious or not, it's still very complicated. But there's no meaning behind that. It's how it works. It's interesting actually how the universe can do that. Can create very, very complicated systems, physical systems, without any meaning behind them. Yeah. That gets you thinking, doesn't it? The etymological implications, this is Claire again, of telos include perfection, completion, unity. Yeah. It's essentially, this is like where you get things such as religious ideas, philosophical ethics, things like that, or political, or kind of political beliefs, which are in a sense visionary. You have like the ideal society you want to create, whether you're a socialist or a conservative or liberal or whatever. Nationalist and things like that. A nationalist's idea of telos would be, for example, a Welsh nationalist would want Wales to be independent, for example, although most Welsh nationalists don't want that nowadays. I won't go into that. I've been having debates with people about that. Okay. Psychologically speaking, consciousness or the soul is seeking that state for itself, one of completion or unity with the divine. This comes into in all kinds of religious and spiritual traditions. The Hindu idea is that you find this in Buddhism as well, is that through the process of life after life after life through reincarnation, you eventually reach the level of the gods. Anthony Peake talks about this as well. How you eventually, as you know, if you follow Anthony Peake, you keep living the same life over and over again in a kind of Groundhog Day type scenario. But as in the film Groundhog Day, the character in Groundhog Day, played by Bill Murray, he eventually ends up he eventually becomes so used to his new existence that he perfects it. He becomes the perfect man within this particular 24-hour eternal cycle that he's in, and only when he can do that can he move on. That's his telos, essentially. He only finds out at the end, but his telos was to be that person. To be there, he saves the girl falling from the tree. He rescues the homeless man. He helps the old ladies with their car when they have a flat tire. Things like that. Claire continues. So ontologically, we are looking at the universe in terms of consciousness as the primary substrate. Yeah, I'd say that's it. Yeah, I mean, I do argue, actually, coming back to what I said earlier, that if there is some kind of consciousness-like process involved in the very physical nature of the universe itself, how can something as complex as a neutron star or a nebula emerge out, just function in essentially a bell jar full of mixed gases, which is what the universe is. It's and that goes back to Ken Wilber's. It's the emergent thing. It's the emergent creativity that Ken Wilber talks about. Claire continues. Now beings may move into greater or lesser degrees of harmony with that sought unity or perfection. Material causes being on a different level may either help or hinder moving into that harmony. Well, yeah, I mean, there's some things that we are affected by random events. We might be walking along underneath a cliff and some rocks will fall on top of us. There's no meaning behind that. It's just bad luck. Yeah, so that will obviously hinder your sought unity or perfection if that happens to you. But in that case, you just have to start again, and you get reincarnated and start again. And it's one of these things. Claire continues. The ethical nihilist sees no greater meaning, or telos, so is subject to the vagaries and rigid limitations of an entropic Newtonian universe, and is rigid. I mean, I know so many ethical nihilists. I mean, ethical nihilism is the norm now, because for the reasons I've stated many times, and I actually did a very good reply video to Stefan Molyneux on this. Molyneux's a weirdo, actually, because he seems to flip from one thing to the other. One moment he's talking about virtue and things like that, and the next moment he's going on about, it's a dog eat dog world, man. The fox chases a rabbit and things like that. And I'm going, Steph, make up your mind. What are you? You can't have it both ways. You're either one or the other. I mean, I made an entire video about that. But yeah, I suppose being an ethical nihilist, you would be like that. You would simply be subject to. You'd be subject to firstly random chance. It'd be random. You'd feel that. You'd really feel it very, very when there's nothing else in your life other than getting by as best you can, seeking the best kind of life you have in a world of random chance, where nothing matters except your own. It's pseudo-psychopathic, actually, to think this, but most people do. How can I get the best life I can out of this particular world I'm living in? That's all that matters. How can I get the quietest, easiest, most pleasurable life I can in this particular world? It's actually quite insecure. You'd feel. I imagine people like that must feel quite unstable, because they are essentially in an unstable equilibrium, where if you have a greater meaning or telos, then essentially you have something you can prioritize above that. If you are not a pseudo-psychopath, like I think only about 20% of people in this world are, or at least in the culture I live in, are not ethical nihilists. They are either psychopaths, that's about 6%, or pseudo-psychopaths, which is 74%. Yeah. Though I mean, I can't really not being one of those people. I can't really think in those terms. Claire continues. Whereas the person who takes ethical responsibility is choosing to navigate the landscape of meaning that is human existence. Yeah, it's. I think it's certainly. I believe it's a happier. I can't say because I'm not in their shoes, but I think it's a more satisfying, enjoyable life if you are not a pseudo-psychopath. And you are not an ethical nihilist, I believe. I don't believe I've never met an ethical nihilist who I believe is happier than myself. Pseudo psychopaths tend to be quite miserable people. Actually, they tend to be. They tend to they lurch from one experience to the next. There's no connection between them. And when bad things happen, there's nothing they can really do except move on to the next experience and hope that it's better. Claire continues, I haven't read Peterson's Maps of Meaning, but I like the phrase, which I imagine he's using in some vaguely related way. Yes, I've not read it. That's Dr. Jordan Peterson. I've not read the book, but I've seen his lectures, and it's very interesting. He's a very interesting chap. He really is. I mean, he's a religious man. He believes in God. He obviously is influenced by that, but he understands these deeper concepts. He's kind of a bit like C.S. Lewis, actually, who Claire is going to come on to in a minute. Claire continues, so we are looking at how we humans fit into a larger context of meaning. Well, some of us are, yeah. Oh, yeah. Claire and I are, yeah. Free will, as I've said, is a problematic term. It is, yeah. I mean, I think you've redefined it. It's the free. We've been up till now, and indeed in these two videos I've made on the comments, we've been dealing with it as something, in a sense, we've been trying to find a cause within the normal causal realm, and of course you can't find one, as I have conceded to David Smith or whoever it was who was disagreeing with me. But maybe now I think you've given me new ammunition now, Claire, to withdraw my concession. It is, as I see it, more like navigating across an ocean in a sailing ship. You can tack or run before the wind in many different ways, some more successful than others, some dangerous and some which might get you wrecked on a rocky shore. Your destination is your destiny. I'll come back to this. That's a good analogy, yeah. That's a good, yeah. Of course, the wind is random. The wind is not necessarily something you have control over. In fact, a sailor essentially allows the wind to propel the ship. It's a propulsion system for the ship, which uses the wind. But at the same time, if the wind gets too strong, it will smash the ship and sink it. But if you learn how to, you can control these natural forces. Yeah. Robert Pirsig makes a compelling argument for the existence of quality as an objective feature of the universe in his Zen and the Art of Motorcycle Maintenance, as does C.S. Lewis in The Abolition of Man for the existence of objective value. Yeah. These are two very famous philosophical books. The Zen and the Art of Motorcycle Maintenance, 1974. C.S. Lewis, The Abolition of Man. He wrote it, I think it was sometime in the 1940s. I've not read this book. I need to read more Lewis, actually. I've only ever read The Chronicles of Narnia. But it's a very famous work. It's one of his most famous non-fictional works. The idea that in a sense, the universe itself has meaning. And I think there's more and more reasons to think that's the case, actually. Yeah, I've not read Pirsig's book. Funny enough, my mum had a copy of it on her bookshelf. It was like a massive bestseller in the 70s. And not just motorcyclists read it. But my mum had a copy. Loads of people were reading it, and when my mum was young, she read it. You know. Claire adds some brackets here. Not values as such, which is a slightly different argument that we don't need to go into here. All right, so this parenthesis, yeah, it says something. Equality and values are different things in this parenthesis. I don't know if that's the. All right, well, yes, she says we won't go into it here, so we won't now. Both of these rely on consciousness as the means whereby these things are understood. Yeah, you can't. Something unconscious cannot understand meaning and value because it can't understand anything. Understanding is in itself a conscious act. It's an act of consciousness. There is a weak argument which suggests a computer algorithm is a kind of unconscious version of that, and you could say that, but even at the basic Pavlovian level of a cat or dog or something, barking because it wants something, it goes beyond that, I think. And where was I? Yeah, so the next stage in the argument becomes simpler. There is objective value and quality in the universe which pre-exist our perception of them. Yes. Again, are very complicated physical structures the result of random chance? Well, scientists will very often say, well, we know how these work, and that's all we need to know. But when you get down to the fundamentals of it, how did the universe create a physical system, a larger, like, super holarchy, to use Ken Wilber's terms, which can create something as amazing as a star, or a tree, or something like that? It's so counterintuitive that I know what Sabine Hoffenstetter, whatever her name is, would say. It doesn't matter. It doesn't matter if it's counterintuitive. Gott in Himmel. Because it was her video that I think Charles or David put me onto, because she's a determinist. But it could be that there is the rejective value, the universe essentially. What was it? C.S. Lewis puts it very well. Well, it's actually a character in it's a character in the Chronicles which actually says this. One character says to another, "Well, a star is just a ball of gas. It's just a lump of fusing gas." And the other character says, "That's not what a star is. That's just what it's made of." Very interesting. This is a very interesting dialogue. Very short two-hander there, but it's very interesting dialogue. Claire continues, when we experience quality or value, we do so in relation to something that already exists. It is thus the consciousness or soul seed which already has the passive recognition template within itself that recognizes the value or quantity. Yeah. Yes, I suppose that's it. It is thus the consciousness or soul seed which already has the passive recognition template within itself that recognizes the value or quality. Yeah, sometimes we recognize these things without even understanding them. Even a pseudo-psychopath will recoil when they do something or they perceive something which they'll perceive the meaning. And a true psychopath cannot do this, but a pseudo-psychopath, they do it all the time. They perceive some kind of meaning in something which they then have to deny. They're forced to deny, which causes a lot of friction in the mind. It clashes with so many other things within themselves. It causes a lot of discomfort, which I think is which is part of the misery of being a pseudo psychopath. But no one has to teach them that. In fact, everything in our education system, our media, our peer pressure is doing the opposite. Everything is leading us towards essentially the total ethical nihilism, and indeed rational nihilism in some cases. Claire continues, of course this is a subtle process which is easily overlaid or modified, but as Lewis points out most persuasively in his abolition, the concept of the good has to come from somewhere, even for the most ardent social relativist, who is perhaps just inventing some twisted notion of what they think is good, but they still need to think it is good and desirable. Yeah, that's an important point. Yeah, even, the difference between, if you want to know if someone's a pseudo-psychopath or a psychopath, see if they try to justify what they do. The psychopath just will do anything; it doesn't care. The pseudo-psychopath will do something. The psychopath will do something bad and just say, "So." But the pseudo-psychopath will say, "Yeah, well, they were asking for it, because they won't stand up for themselves. So it's okay for me to abuse them. It's okay for me to exploit them, because they're just such mugs." That's a pseudo-psychopath talking when they say that. So good essentially is the ethical equivalent of happiness, according to Socrates. Socrates said, happiness is the one thing that we seek which has no purpose. It's just something we want. Once we got it, that's it. Everything is geared towards finding happiness. If you want to be happy, you find things that make you happy. Once you're happy, you don't say, "Well, what am I going to use this happiness to find?" So good is essentially the ethical equivalent of Socratic happiness. That's a good point. Yeah. Claire continues. So to return to the earlier point of soul causality and the implied infinite regress of homunculi all the way down, there is an alternative, but one which some might find unpalatable. I don't think I will, but anyway, Claire says, the alternative is that there is objective value in the universe. What works is perhaps the simplest way of putting it. We're bringing Occam's razor again now, yeah. It's, although, of course, that is subject to critique and needs to be defended for the whole or some such. But again, we have a solid foundation in that it must work for somebody, or we fall into the abyss of postmodernist power models in which there is no good, and contradictorily, all power is bad, etc., etc. Yeah, it's actually, that's a kind of obvious difference. I realise that, Claire. Yeah, but it's worth stating. But I mean, I can see the obvious difference. Yeah. Claire says, we can see how these relativistic type models are unable to support themselves with internal consistency. Well, yeah, they try. They really try. But again, it's counter-entropic in a kind of in a mental sort of metaphysical way. Yeah, it's counter-entropic. It's what was the term I used? Struggling to go uphill when you can just simply go downhill on a smooth road. You know. So I return to the alternate model that there is value. It does exist as a quality, even a fundamental quantity. Even a fundamental quality in the universe besides simple material things and events. Consciousness or the soul has some relation to both and thus mediates reality, which is pretty much our intuitive sense of the world as it is. Yeah. You know, it's like, it's like that wonderful documentary by David Malone, The Testing God. He says, science has taught us to doubt what we cannot prove, but does proof really reflect the world we live in and the people that we are? Oh, it's so wonderful. It's such a wonderful documentary, that. I'll tell you what. Do watch it. It's a 3-part documentary. If you want to watch just one part, just watch the third part, Credo Ergo Sum. The other two are kind of just like second fiddle to that one. That is the big one, I think. The third part of that 3-part series. Claire says, reaching the question of choice, then, we are left with the question of how consciousness or soul responds to quality or value. A soul that is in tune with value will recognise it and try to respond to it, whereas one that is not won't. The value and meaning are the telos that the consciousness is seeking. That's it. I suppose every non-psychopath, pseudo-psychopath, stroke pseudo-psychopath will understand that. I found this as well. I just know, I can just feel when I'm on the right track. I mean, as you might know from my videos about the videos I made when I got discharged from the NHS and was kicked out of hospital portering. I don't like using the word sacked because I don't consider it a legitimate process that I was subjected to. But I think I was actually improperly and I was wrongfully terminated, I believe. But I won't go into that now. I've made loads of videos about that at the time. I felt something reassuring the whole time. I did feel a sense of reassurance. It was intuitive. It was something I couldn't put my finger on, but I just somehow felt that I was on. Someone was saying, just don't worry, you're on the right track. Just keep going, stick by your guns, don't give up. And you'll be glad to know that I've actually said this before, but you'll be glad to know I have that same feeling now about the current world we're living in, the current world order that is being constructed around us, the authoritarianism to do with the C word and things like that. The C word being the disease that's currently sweeping the world, and all the things associated with that. I've got that same feeling of reassurance right now that says, don't worry, you're on the right track, just stick with it. And this could be an example, I'm saying, of the soul within me recognizing a value and meaning and seeking the outcome of that, and the feeling that I am well on the way. I'm going in the right direction. Claire continues, a soul that is more in tune with the good and value will freely choose those things which accord with it, while those who aren't are more constrained in their actions because their actions will lead to less good or even harm. Yeah, some, of course, even pathologically seek out harm. They get some kind of perverse enjoyment from it. I mean, I've known so many people like that, yeah. But constrained is a good way of putting it. Because you are, I mean, if you are a pseudo-psychopath, you essentially are, you're channeling everything you do, think and say down a very narrow alleyway where there is no value. There is simply, as I said, a series of experiences that don't cohere. Some are good, some are bad. There's no explanation for any of them. There's no process leading from one leading to another. Yeah. Claire says, this is where random acts as beings free falls down. Random acts as being free falls down. But this is where random acts as being free falls down. Yeah. Random acts as being. Freedom must be the freedom to choose good or bad, but there must also be a reason or meaning behind it. Determinists put up a straw man argument here because they don't allow the existence of value, meaning and purpose which exist within the unique entelechy. That's to do with the monads, which I gather is similar to Ken Wilber's holons, his holarchy. One other thing Leibniz points out about monads or entelechies is that they are each unique since they are perceiving the universe from a unique perspective. This, amongst other possible reasons, contributes to the unique characteristics of each soul. A soul is something that each person has as an individual. So, in our example, your consciousness is different from my consciousness, etc. But there is something that connects them. This takes us back to the 100th Monkey. Indeed, Claire's first book is called Waking the Monkey. It's called Waking the Monkey, and that's the 100th Monkey thing. I don't need to repeat that. I've discussed it before in various videos that I've done, especially my Is There Any Hope video. I talk about the monkeys that Lyle Watson talked about. Which means there is a connection within consciousness that unites all, Carl Jung's collective subconscious. Claire says, this is why many religions believe in the predestination of the soul, because its path is determined by its own nature. Well, yeah, I mean, this is the fundamentals. Most religions are like this. There's always some kind of direction you go on in. With Christianity, it is union with God through belief through Jesus Christ the Saviour, who came down, was born, died to redeem our sin. And the objection is to get as close to Jesus as possible. The Muslims have a very similar idea, except they believe that Muhammad was the last prophet of God, and that the end times, which again is very similar to the Christian vision. I've done a whole video on the apocalypse, which is one of my favourite videos, actually. Essentially leads to some kind of it's some kind of purposive, and there's an appointed end, and that everything in the universe is purposive, leading towards that appointed end, the apocalypse. Yeah. Claire says, this in many instances leads to a reincarnation model in which the soul evolves and becomes more in tune with the good so that it becomes freer. That could be paradoxical in the sense you could say that the soul essentially is a predestination, could be, and Claire actually uses the term determined in her previous sentence. That it's not like she's going to explain in a minute why that is not determinism. That is not spiritual determinism in any way. In other words, it's because she says it becomes freer through this determined route, and Claire will explain exactly what that means in a minute, because I have read this article before I made the video. Claire says, there is an interesting turn of phrase in the Book of Common Prayer in which it refers to God, whose service is perfect freedom. So a soul or consciousness which chooses the good because it is in tune with it, does it freely, but is determined by its own nature to do so. To choose the good surely must be akin to freedom, increasing. To choose the bad, the opposite, constraint, imprisonment, closed, with diminishing options. Yeah. I've noticed this, as I explained, I've noticed this in people's behaviour. The soul potential is explored and expressed through material experience. Yeah, that's certainly true. I mean, life is a bloody experience, isn't it? And It is the seed within the soul that gives the meaning, which is expressed in its choices. You know, by the way, you always know, right, if you've had a good life. Say you're, I mean, old. I mean, I'm I'm sort of like, what am I? I'm what the goodies called the in-betweenies. I won't say exactly how old I am. I'm neither old nor young. But supposing you're old and you look back and you think, damn, I made so many mistakes in my life. I wish I could go back to when I was like 18 years old and live my life all over again. I would make such different choices. I would do so many things differently, you know. And I think this myself sometimes. I've discussed this in this video about how I would go back, if I could go back to like being a teenager. I'd live my life now completely differently. I would avoid certain people, things like that, you know. I'd avoid certain experiences. Well, the only reason the only reason you have these thoughts and feelings is because you've learnt lessons along the way. That's why you have this desire to go back and change things. You can't go back and change things. That's impossible. But the very fact that you have that wish, that fantasy, is a wonderful sign. It's something you should rejoice in, because it means you've learnt a lot during the course of your life. Claire says, this seed is a cause, but not in a material Newtonian way. It's what the medieval philosophers called the final cause, a term C.S. Lewis was keen on. The great attractor, some might call it. I think Ken Wilber used that term, the great attractor. I've heard it before. Soul alignment with the good must inevitably lead to an ever greater and widening field of opportunity. All those things we know to be good, health, wealth, prosperity, fulfillment, love, and so forth. Soul alignment with the bad must lead to a diminishing spiral of lessening opportunities, ultimately. The good is ever higher integration with universal laws, while the bad is the opposite, separation and denial. Yeah, I mean, I've done bad things in my time. I've made mistakes, and I do get whenever that happens, whenever I do something wrong. I think I've described the time where I got angry with my friend and poured a can of beer over his head. And then I walked down a street. Literally a minute later, after I walked down a street, I was away from there. A minute later, someone else came up and punched me in the face. It's almost like that was a karmic cycle. I felt that, you know, it's almost like I was heading down this route, which is separation, denial. And what's it? Lessening opportunity, a spiral. I was going down a diminishing spiral, lessening opportunity. And luckily enough, something very, very abrupt happens to me, which told me that that's what I was doing. Yeah, Graham Hancock actually describes very, very poignantly, I think, in his not even in his book Supernatural, but in more recent interviews, one of the ones he did with Joe Rogan, about how he was ruining his life. He doesn't talk about this in his literature previously, but he was misusing cannabis. He was like basically a pothead, and he was so bad that it was, you know, because pot could be really good, as Bill Hicks said. You know, he talks about cannabis all the time, how wonderful it can be, but it can be abused. And it could be very bad. I'm sure Hugo Rune has a lot to say about this. But Graham, you know, I suggest Hugo Rune. You may be familiar with Graham Hancock already, but his experience with cannabis you'd probably find interesting, because for Hancock it became a kind of bane on his. It became a millstone around his neck, and he had to quit, for at least temporarily, quit using it, because it was ruining his marriage. He was becoming impossible to live with, things like that. Okay, where was I? That was a bit of a digression. Where did I get to? Soul alignment was the bad. Yes, soul alignment with the bad. Right, yeah. The good is ever higher integration with universal laws, while the bad is the opposite, separation and denial. Right, that's it. I'll put the cursor. I'll put the cursor on the spot where I'll know where I am. So because I'm using Microsoft Word here, so I know where I am. So free will, as posed by the materialist reductionist, is a fallacy, whether set up intentionally or unknowingly. So Claire is basically saying that the whole debate we've had up till now is based on this the deluded version of the whole issue. Never mind, we can carry on. We'll carry on now, probably with this new knowledge, this new light that's been shined on the subject. Whether intentionally or knowingly, I don't know, but maybe subconsciously, intentionally, accidentally, on purpose, as the saying goes. Claire says, returning to the point that belief in free will produces a more functional... What time is it? Bloody hell, time's getting on. How long have I been going for? And I'll go as long as it takes. Whether that a belief in free will produces a more functional society than the one of apathy that would result in a deterministic dominated one. Oh yeah, I mean, again, we're coming back to simple practicalities here. What works best, as Claire puts it very simply? One of apathy, which again, pseudo-psychopathy, moral nihilism, which is what seems to be... I think the Illuminati are basically demolishing society by turning people into pseudo-psychopaths. But basically, that's what it's been. That's the function of it. That one of apathy will result in a determinist-dominated one. So in a sense, determinism possibly serves the Illuminati's purpose. She says, we can begin to see why that would be the case. Yeah, because believing, she says Claire now, because behaving in such a way that is in accordance with actuality is bound to be more functional than behaving in a way that as to deny it. Yeah. Oh, now this is interesting. Although the dark magician will perhaps seek to act against the good as an act of choice, in the end it all leads to limitation. That sentence, I think, sums up what I've just said about the Illuminati and what they're doing at the moment. Yes. So the final cause, says Claire, of our existence is the motivator. We may navigate in various ways, but in the end there is the end goal, union with the divine or unified field of consciousness. And that's it, yeah. So that sounds nice, doesn't it? I mean, I'd like that, wouldn't I? Yeah. I'd like to do that. Claire says, soul determinism may not, in quotes, may not be the kind of free will model that some would like to see, but it steps outside the two main problems. I've just stopped in the middle of a sentence there, hang on. Soul determinism would be kind of what we've been talking about with the determined path of the soul, union with the divine or unified field of consciousness, which could be seen as similar to determinism when it's actually not. Two main problems with the conventional debate: the causal prison of the perpetual regress all the way down model, and on the other side, a meaninglessness of completely random behavior. Yeah, this seems to be the two. This seems to be the two ways people see it. The first simply doesn't work, and the second is, well, meaningless, completely random behavior. It's kind of like, I think that's the dominant. The second one seems to be the dominant paradigm, I think. The first is conventional religious belief and things like that, or maybe what Molyneux believes, I don't know. Claire says, the single biggest problem we seem to face as a feature of living in a material world is being ourselves in the face of external pressures. Oh, good grief. Welcome to the fundamental purpose of my channel and things like that, yeah. And of a Panwo itself. Certainly, we must, this is Claire again, certainly we must accommodate material existence, maintain the body, as Krishna has it in the Bhagavad Gita. But to achieve some kind of happiness and fulfillment, we must also bring forth that which is within us and unique. Else what is the purpose of human existence? Well, the conventional idea, Claire, is there is no purpose to human existence. You get born, you live as happy and easy life as you can, and then you die. When it comes to moral nihilism, you can see actually moral nihilism, pseudo-psychopathy, explains so much about the behavior of many people. Why would a pseudo-psychopath refuse to put on a mask or refuse to get the V word? It makes their life easier if they do it. So of course they're going to do it. Claire says, so we have through our Gestalt field a means of synthesizing meaning from the impression of the material senses on the monad, which has an inherent sense of meaning. That's saying basically that our experiences in life, with the intersection between what we perceive and what we experience in our lifetime, essentially it works the other way around. It works on the soul in the same way that the soul works on the material. Claire says, this is most definitely not causal determinism in the conventional sense, but the means of ingress into the material world of meaning and value through consciousness. Which, yeah, it's a two-way thing, isn't it? The soul influences the world you experience influences your soul, yeah. Claire says, which are factors entirely orthogonal to the linear sequential action of material causality. Yeah, you surely can see that now. Interested to see what David Smith thinks of this. Claire says, determinists will not like this argument because they are unwilling to address the hard problem. But it is central. It is a paradox because we live in a material world and they want material causes. Because they're a material girl. Yeah, all right. I couldn't resist that, yeah. If they really insist, then I posit Sheldrake's fields, mediated by cymatic resonance. Cymatica is a good film. I mean, it's very, very. There's a good film called Cymatica which talks about that, about basically how different things emerge from various vibrations. A vibration is a kind of hippie thing to say, but that's what cymatics is. Cymatics is vibration creating form, and there's an entire documentary called Cymatica which is about that. Claire says, cymatic resonance stepped down in frequency by such organs as the pineal gland. This is what Descartes said, that this is where the soul intersected with the body. And funnily enough, Graham Hancock in Supernatural and the guy who wrote the DMT, the spirit molecule, what's his name? They said basically the same thing. They said that the pineal gland is actually essential in this whole process, thus creating organization at the quantum level of neuronal firing. That would mean basically directing the workings of the brain. Rick Strassman, yeah, that's the guy who wrote DMT, the spirit molecule, yeah. Penrose and Hammerhoff have done extensive work on quantum tubules, which are involved in neuronal firing. Yes, Stuart Hammerhoff is actually he's a doctor, he's an anaesthetist, and he's been working on the process of consciousness in his spare time. He's a mean-looking guy. He's got this he's got this kind of Sergio Leone film beard. He looks like some kind of Wild West villain, but he's actually a really nice sort of guy. Very interesting chap. He appears in What the Bleak Do We Know and various other documentaries. Roger Penrose is a former colleague of Stephen Hawking, and he's gone very much from the normal world of physics into this consciousness research. And he's done some very interesting work on the brain. Now, what Hammerhoff and Penrose have discovered about the brain. Hammerhoff actually puts it very well. He says, I used to put people to sleep for their operations, and I used to think, where do they go when I'm doing that? It was a simple question that came out of his practical day-to-day work, which led to his current area of belief. Interesting chap, Hammerhoff. As I said, he's not as mean as he looks. But the brain has these things inside it, which Penrose and Hammerhoff believe make the brain a quantum computer. Anyway, Claire continues here. But I must emphasize that these material responses originate in the realm of meaning and relation to the telos of the soul. So that's it. So obviously, when you make a decision based on the telos of the soul, it's the same as any other decision you make. You know, the dog might obey its Pavlovian response to go for the tit bit that the owner throws down, but at the same time, will abandon that in favour of something else if it believes, for example, if someone he loves, like its puppy or something, is in need of some assistance. In a sense, that feeling, the feeling which gives meaning to living beings, will override the simple materialistic. You see, the pseudo-psychopath the psychopath won't give a damn and will simply go for the tit bit. If there are such things as psychopath dogs, I don't know. There are certainly pseudo-psychopathic dogs, I know. But if the psychopath dog will simply go for the biscuit, I mean, ironically, some people actually say that cats are natural psychopaths, so maybe cats are a better example here. The cat. So I love cats. I love stroking them, but unfortunately they do seem to be psychopathic. a psychopathic animal of any kind would simply go for the tit bit. As a pseudo-psychopathic one, whether it's a human or a dog or a cat, would go for the tit bit, but would feel deep down, no matter what kind of education and programming and indoctrination they've had, they will feel a wrench within themselves whenever they do it. Something will twist inside them, something painful when they do it, which is where the misery of being a pseudo-psychopath comes from. Yet the non-psycho pseudo-psychopath would go and rescue their puppy. So that's a material response originating from the realm in relation to the telos of the soul. We're nearly done now with this article. It's a long one, but it's really good. Claire says, consciousness is often conceived of as an eye, or more specifically as a lens. It is the lens between the material world, which it perceives, and the world of mind, which responds vibrationally, setting up cymatic resonances and Sheldrake's fields. Yeah, this is... C.S. Lewis puts it very well. One of his most famous quotes is God is not a thing I see, it's the light by which I see everything else. That's one of C.S. Lewis's most famous quotes. Alistair McGrath often repeats it when he's debating with Richard Dawkins and other atheo-skeptico-materialists. Claire says, I only add this coda on mechanism because some will not be satisfied with the teleological argument on the hard problem. Well, I don't think you will ever... if people really are unwilling to look at the hard problem and deny it, then I don't think they probably would be interested in what you have to say, Claire. But Claire says here, the hard problem is the entry point to this. Yeah, I understand. I understand how the two now intersect, the two problems. Although you can deal with one and not the other, but it's easier to deal with them together. It's the entry point to this, but this argument is not an explanation of consciousness. Consciousness just is. Like the lens is transparent. It is the inner response that is important. The more that the inner response aligns with the good and ethical responsibility, then the greater the degrees of freedom, like a good captain knowing how best to sail the challenging seas. Thanks, Claire. That's a really interesting article. I've learned a lot from it. And I've actually looked... There's a bit of something else I've learned, which I think is relevant here. It's to do with Laplace's demon. There's some new discoveries which indicate that Laplace's demon could never exist, because it's not possible. It says here that there's been proposed a limit on the computational power, the potential computational power of the universe, the ability of Laplace's demon to process an infinite amount of information. The limit is based on the maximum entropy of the universe, the speed of light, and the minimum amount of time taken to move information across the Planck length. The Planck length is basically the space in which quantum fluctuation happens. It's the smallest possible thing in the universe. It's the thing, nothing can be smaller than the Planck length, because that's where you get like a subatomic, it's a subatomic oscillation. And this is what it is, 1.61625 brackets 18 times 10 to the power of minus 35 meters. Now, how small is that? That's smaller than you can imagine. A grain of salt and an elephant are the same size, basically. You can categorize them as the same size when you're dealing with something that tiny. And nothing can be smaller than that. So, move information across the Planck length, and the figure was shown to be about 10,120 bits. Accordingly, anything that requires more than this amount of data cannot be computed in the amount of time that has elapsed so far in the universe. The implication is random determinism is not possible. So now, David splendid isolation and got into a debate, and several people have... And David Smith, I'll just call them Smith and isolation, just so we don't get into like which David are you talking about. I'm going to go for these comments. I didn't address them in the comments reply video because they're too specialised to this subject. It would basically have turned my comments reply video into another free will video, and I wanted to put it into a free will video. But he says this. Isolation says, there is also no scientific explanation for consciousness, why it exists at all. And consciousness and free will are two sides of the same coin. You remove one, you remove the other. And yet we know consciousness exists, as it's always self-evident to us. Free will is also self-evident, but again without scientific explanation. I found that atheists among the self-proclaimed intelligentsia are more likely to choose hard determinism as a worldview, because ultimately it's a morality issue. If a person is always predetermined to act in a certain way, then there can never be any ultimate moral accountability for decisions made, because that person couldn't help but make them. And that would mean there's ultimately no such thing as crime and justice, which is what many of them secretly crave, just in case there really is a moral judge who created mankind and the universe and to whom they are morally accountable. That's a point that Claire and I both made, David's Splendid Isolation. That's absolutely right. David Smith says in reply, I'll just call him Smith, I'll address this again because you're still being dishonest, dear Dave. Free will and consciousness aren't two sides of the same coin. Consciousness is created by a functioning brain. Stop the brain from functioning, and as far as we can tell, consciousness ceases. Well, Smith, what happens is if you stop the brain functioning, people die. Now that means they no longer have a conscious impact on this particular world. They are a dead body. They're an inanimate lump of meat. But that doesn't address the theories beyond that, such as what I've talked about with psychical research and the paranormal and the afterlife and things like that. Smith says there's good evidence to counter that. Well, yeah, we've been debating it, but I don't agree. There's evidence which I believe is incorrect. Free will is not self-evident. It is a feeling. Basing something to be true based on a feeling isn't a good way of discovering truth. We don't feel like we're on a circular planet flying through space. Yet try getting a functional satellite up there without taking that into account. Well, firstly, as Claire has explained, it's more complicated than simply saying a feeling is basing something to be true. Well, as Claire has explained, Smith, there is actually a reason. It's not just feeling, it's a reason to believe that there is free will, or ethical determinism as she calls it. And as for the circular planet flying on space, this is a flat Earth debate. I'm not going to get into that. It does feel like we're on a circular planet flying through space, and indeed you can observe it. You don't need to go into space to find out. So all those flat earthers out there, say, well, Ben, you've never been into space. Well, I don't know. Ask Captain Kirk. He boldly went, even though others have been there before, and see what he has to say. Smith says, the really dishonest part is when you try to say atheists secretly crave a lack of justice or accountability. That's just plain false and goes against the evidence we have for all the religious killings and teachings to kill, all the religious people who murder, rape, abuse, steal, etc. Being a believer in God apparently isn't a prevention. In fact, it can lead people killing others because they know that their God will forgive them if they just have faith and really believe. All right, that's a fair point, Smith, I must say. I think isolation may be making assumptions about what motivates a religious person. I mean, the thing is, atheists make the same assumptions about religious people. Atheists say, for example, well, you believe in an afterlife because you can't bear the thought of dying. Look at my MBA. Of course, then you get an infinite regress because, well, my answer is an infinite regress to that because I can say, well, it's your MBA. You have exactly the same desire because of your MBA and things like that. So, but anyway, I'm just giving an example here of why it's not just religious people who make assumptions about atheists' motivations. The reverse is true. Smith says, another angle to view it could be the religious people who have killed their children, believing that doing so will prevent them from having a chance to sin and go to hell. I've heard about things like that. That's bloody awful, but I've heard about it happening, yeah. Believing in things before good evidence has been shown for them leads you into a position that is contradictory. You would then need to believe lots of claims and feelings you have no good evidence to support them. That have no good evidence to support them, many of which would contradict one another. Hence, logically, rationally, and reasonably, it's not a position anymore anyone should take if the goal is to get to the truth of the situation. Literally, that's actually true. But I don't know about contradict one another. I don't think they do, though, you see. This is something that's got to be debated between you and Smith, and between you in isolation and myself. Societies collectively decide what they view as moral and just and make laws accordingly. It requires no God or free will to hold someone accountable. If someone causes harm, it's very easy to make a case that they would cause further harm, so need removing from society into a facility where they could no longer inflict pain and suffering on the public. But as I've just said with Claire Smith, In that case, why don't we simply turn prisons into internment camps, which are simply basically just towns and villages with fences around them? Now, Smith says, now, in order to deal with crime, we can't actually use free will as a driving factor. This is because we understand that human behaviours have causes. If you don't believe this, then explain why is it people spend huge amounts of money sending their children to top-tier schools and other educational powerhouses. It's why parents often forbid their kids from hanging out with a bad crowd. They may not know it, but they are demonstrating their understanding of the cause and effect nature of human behaviour. Yeah, that's true, Smith. However, that could simply be they don't. It's as Claire would say in her article. They don't want their children to undergo experiences that would lead them to get the wrong ideas, which would lead them to do the wrong things. That's not quite the same as saying determinism therefore is real. It's not quite the same because the same kid might hang out with the same bad crowd. One will do things that the bad crowd likes and go along with them. Another child will reject it. Why? Well, if determinism was real, then every single child would simply hang out with the bad crowd and behave exactly the same way with the bad crowd. I mean, it's an oversimplification, but that's kind of where the determinism thing falls flat, I believe. Smith says, it's the same for religions. Is it just a coincidence that people born in the Middle East will most likely become Islamic, or people born in India will most likely become Hindus? The regional differences are clear. Another sign that we don't freely choose despite the feelings they may have at the time. That's true. I mean, you essentially are products of the culture you're born into. As I've explained, a lot of people who are pseudo-psychopaths are only pseudo-psychopaths because we live in a culture which deliberately encourages pseudo-psychopathy. But some people, like myself, are born into that culture, and we are not pseudo-psychopaths. I don't believe I'm not a pseudo-psychopath because of my upbringing and because of my culture. You see, everyone else my father is a pseudo-psychopath. My brother is not, but my mother was very much a pseudo-psychopath, I believe. And actually, no, not my mother wasn't. Actually, she wasn't a pseudo-psychopath. But what I'm saying is that look, let me start again. I have turned out differently from the rest of my family. I'm very different from my brother. I'm very different to my dad and my mother. I'm different to both my dad and my mother and all my extended family, and indeed almost everyone I know in my social circles. I'm different to all of them. How did that happen? If I was born in the Middle East, I may well have been a Muslim. I'd probably be born into a Muslim family. But some people in the Middle East, they leave Islam. I mean, very often they have to leave their country of origin if they're in Saudi Arabia, for example. Certainly their families won't like it very much if they're very devout. However, not everyone stays an Islamist, or sorry, a Muslim, if that happens. Smith says, to deal with crime, we need to understand the causes of crime. If you're just going to chalk it up to people using free will, then you miss the opportunity to tackle the real-world causes, which could go some way to reducing future harmful behaviours. And how could you address those factors if you're busy claiming it's free will? Why lock anybody up if it's simply a case of them making a free choice to not act in a harmful way next time? Oh, I see your point here, right? There are causes. People may have free will, I think, but there are causes. Certain people undergo experiences that make them more likely to do certain things. If they live in some really rough estate, man, they grow up and they grow up in the culture of that. And I've seen this myself many times in my own hometown. They will, through peer pressure, behave in the way that most other youths on that estate do. That's a cause of crime. Indeed, a lot of the work that the local police force has been doing actually in Oxford before they went all C-word crazy, is they actually reduced the crime level in Oxford by organising football matches between the police and the local police officers and the local youths. It created a sense of meaning, you know, things, and sport actually is a great way of doing that in these situations. So, in a sense, that I do agree with what you're saying. I'm introducing sport into people's lives. It deals, especially for men who have a natural aggression and a desire to compete. It's a wonderful way of reducing crime and violence. You know? So I agree with you, but that doesn't exactly contradict the point to do with free will. Dave Smith, there is a plethora of great evidence and writings on human behaviour, and how we're influenced by varying factors from genetic predispositions to environmental influences. Yet there is none laying out a good foundational amount of evidence for free will. You can believe it, you can make claims about it, but ultimately that won't overturn what we know to be true already. Your beliefs may be in conflict with science, so I suggest a closer examining of your beliefs. Isolation replies, it's never black and white. It's never a black and white issue. Never been a black and white issue, really. Much like the discussion about naturalism, no God, versus the existence of God and intelligent design. All we need is a relatively little bit of intelligent design in order to falsify the naturalist and no design position. Well, isolation. Watch my video on Professor John Lennox. And it causes a huge effect. Obviously, there are factors that drive conclusions and influence decisions in the lives of individuals. I've never said that there's no such thing as deterministic cause, only that free will exists at a certain level. Because even with a plethora of pressures outside of our control being examined and being exacted upon us to force us down one predetermined avenue at the end of the day, all we need is a little bit of free will where we can say no. A little bit goes a long way. You're kind of making the same point I do. And so we have the ultimate power to defy or agree with the forces enacted upon us. And this is what free will's about. Yeah, exactly. That's true, isolation. It's why I believe mankind is in this terrible state of pain and death today. The ability to freely choose, freely, use proper grammar, isolation, freely defy and go on a different path of personal preference. Yeah, that's true. In a sense, we could. It was almost like that. That phrase that Adam Curtis always talks about. You know, the big secret of the world. He's quoting this guy who died, who was involved in the Occupy movement, David Graeber. David Graeber, who was one of the leaders of the Occupy movement, he died last year, and he said this: the ultimate hidden truth of the world is that it is something we make and could just as easily make differently. Yeah, I love that. That's absolutely so true. Isolation says, so really there's a mix of both predeterminism and free will, but like intelligent design in the origins argument, all you need is a bit of a constant final decision of free thought in order to break foolish thinking. Neither of these positions is demonstrable within science because we cannot measure all the variables involved. To falsify predeterminism or free will, but this is where science doesn't have all the answers, and in my opinion never can, because consciousness, in my opinion, doesn't solely reside in brain chemistry as you claim. I do not believe it's a trick, just who is being tricked. I believe in the self, the person, the self-aware individual that resides in this body and locale, consciousness being something that shouldn't even exist at all, if we are the biological equivalent of an automaton. So I can see you're not ready yourself because of that other faith you cling to. The one you claim isn't one. It's become incompatible, but eventually I believe you will be. It's become incompatible, but eventually I believe you will be. One could almost say you're predestined. That's a very good comment, Isolation. You really do have a way with words. I mean, I couldn't put that. I've kind of made similar points myself. You know, why do we have consciousness? It's not necessary for evolution. We can do all the things we do. We can eat, fuck, breathe, and things like that without consciousness. We could have a very low level of consciousness, like bacteria, or something like that, and it wouldn't matter, would it? So why do we have consciousness? Why? What's its purpose? Smith says, of course we can say no. It's why we say no. It's the why we say no part that's the issue. It's the why we say no part that's the issue. It's a why emphasized. All I can see you're doing is making claims without giving any rational arguments to support them. Free will isn't about defying. We can defy without free will. Stop replying to me. No? See, easy. It's the why we defy or accept. Why our personal preferences are what they are. That requires addressing in order to break foolish thinking. Well, David Smith, that's kind of almost that's a kind of infinite regress on the determinist side, which is very similar to the homunculus fallacy for the of the free will side. So you say, well, yeah, I'm choosing to do this, but why am I choosing to do it? Because of other choices I made or other people made for my life in the past. Why did they make those choices, etc., etc.? So essentially, you could go back right back to the amoeba or something with those kinds of arguments. So, in a sense, that's not really answering isolation's question. Smith says one claiming God, intelligent design and free will exists, yet offers no good evidence for any of it. We cannot measure all the variables involved to falsify predeterminism or free will. Unfortunately, if you want to prove one side or the other, Smith, I suspect you're right, and there is no way to falsify either side completely. But all we can do is, I think both of us can make the best judgment based on the evidence we have. Smith says, then you haven't studied enough on the subjects. We have an understanding that to raise kids into decent adults requires love, care, education, and loads of other factors and inputs. When those are not met, we understand that it can lead to behaviours not conducive to societal health and well-being. Yeah, well, that's absolutely true. I mean, you look at criminals and people who commit crimes, they often do have bad upbringings in which, for example, a man who beats his wife, you can almost be certain was beaten himself as a child by his parents. He may well have been bullied at school and in turn become a bully. He may well have a background in harming animals and things like that. And you could say, well, it's because of that experience in early life that he does what he does now to his own wife. And that's true. That's absolutely true. That's not an argument against free will. I think both myself and Isolation have explained this. A lot of people have those kinds of experiences, yet they don't beat their wife because they know it's wrong and they choose not to. This is why I got very angry with when the way my mother abused me. My father used to make excuses for her. He'd just say, well, it's her bad upbringing, things like that. She had a very bad upbringing. It was also like a cliche. She had such a bad upbringing, as if, again, he was denying her ability to make choices. And essentially saying she was destined to abuse me, and she did. She psychologically abused me, and she was destined to. And she not only psychologically abused me, she brought other people into the house. One to psychologically abuse me, another to physically abuse me with violence. She brought them into the house and allowed them to do that. She made the choice to do that. She was a sane person. I know because she could alter her behaviour at the tip of a hat. If someone she wanted to suck up to came into the house, her personality would flip like that. But it doesn't matter. She made that choice. She's responsible for that choice. End of. Smith says, consciousness, in my opinion, doesn't solely reside in brain chemistry as you claim. Consciousness is the product of a working brain. Well, that's the same thing, isn't it? It's not brain chemistry, it's the consciousness of a product of the working brain. Well, those two things are the same, aren't they? Anyway, he carries on. If you can prove anything different, then please do. I'd very much love some kind of existence for duality or an afterlife. Oh my goodness. Smith, are you giving up your MBA here? Are you going to be a jelly? Oh, dearie me. You won't be able to hold your head up in your skeptic meetings now, will you, you jelly? You're supposed to be, I can face up to it, man. I've got the strength and the courage and I'm a superior to everyone else. I can face up to it. That's what you're supposed to do. Come on, Smith. Do your stuff. MBA! MBA, come on. You can do better than this. Consciousness being something that shouldn't exist at all, if all we are is the biological equivalent of autonomy. Oh, he's just quoting Isolation here. Okay. Why shouldn't it exist? It's helpful in creating societies, being able to feel empathy and compassion. Working together is what allows us to flourish and thrive in many areas. Consciousness has a hand in facilitating that. Just because you don't like the implication of what all this means, what this all means is not a good argument against it. But at the same time, did empathy, compassion, and creating and the ability to create societies did these things come about because we are conscious, or in a sense? Well, I think what your main is, I think it's kind of a reverse cause and effect here. It is indeed the fact we're conscious allows us to do these things. It allows us essentially to be human. Yet, why did we become human in the first place, to a position where we could create societies, feel empathy and compassion? Why did we? Why did we evolve this way? And did our evolution lead us inevitably to consciousness? Or because when life, as you know, a life simply has to reproduce, breathe, eat, things like that. It's simply a chemical process, essentially, life. As was it Richard Dawkins says, all it wants is for your genes to survive to the next generation. Your genes are selfish, and this is what they do. So, why not just use the simplest possible mechanism, asexual reproduction, meiosis, mitosis of bacteria and archaea. Why develop into these complex organisms, which makes things more difficult, and actually think and feel and things like that. And he quotes isolation here. The only other faith you cling to, one can, and that little bit here. The other faith you cling to, the one you claim isn't one. It's become incompatible, but eventually I believe you will. One could say you're predestined. Little joke there by isolation. Smith says, wow, what a cowardly response. Making proclamations about what I believe whilst addressing fuck all of the questions I specifically asked to expose your fallacious thinking. Nice dishonesty, Dave. I can see your beliefs block you from being rational. This is clearly why you have a hard-on against atheists. Your inability to address these subjects in a rational manner is what you need to continue your belief in the unproven and irrational. I don't blame you, though, because I understand you didn't freely will yourself to be a victim to your unfounded religious claims. All right, so I think you guys are now both kind of using rhetoric against the other in many various ways, and yeah, I can see what Isolation said was very provocative, so I think Smith has responded exactly the way Isolation wanted him to. So, and Isolation says to Smith, why do you people usually have such a chip on your shoulder and resort to profanity and the obnoxious? Oh, Isolation, come on, you wound him up, mate. You wound him up. For someone who claims the opposite, the rational, to not be concerned about God and the eternal, you sure fulfill that type rather easily. You respond, dare I say it, as if you had free will. Methinks the lady doth protest too much, but then you were predestined to, so it's not your fault, or mine, SMH. What does SMH mean? I better look that up. SMH. Sydney Morning Herald. No, that's not it. SMH. Oh, hang on. It's some kind of meme. I don't know. Business is other. Shaking my head. All right, shaking my head. That's it. All right. I'm not in with tech speak, man. I'm not in with tech speak. Oh, it's off now. It's off now. Boxing gloves, everyone. Seconds away. Round one. Smith says, why do some people try to be condescending, dishonest, and irrational? I don't know, Dave. Why don't you use your free will you claim to have and override the generated desire I'm giving you to reply? You claim and think that, but all your other comments you fail to back up any of it up. Just assertions which can be asserted without evidence and can be dismissed without it too. Well, I suppose that's true. That's true, Smithy. You can. I think it's a bit of a cliche, but if you assert without evidence, you can dismiss without evidence. Except that tends to be a bit of a one-way street within the skeptic world. You know, they can assert, for example, 19 hijackers did 9/11 without evidence, and that's considered common sense. And anyone who dismisses it is a conspiracy theorist. However, when someone else tries to do the other way round, the skeptics then they then throw a wobbly about it. So, although what you say is actually true, it's very often used as a bit of a double standard within the skeptosphere. Isolation says, well, I'm predestined to do all that. You're predestined or determined to hold it against me, so there's nothing we can do in and of our own free will to change it. Smith, oops, where are we now? Smith says, no, you're confusing fatalism with determinism. Learn the difference and try again. That's what happens when you wait for your turn. You just wait for your turn to talk instead of addressing the points raised. Smith, what is the difference between fatalism and determinism? As Jasper Carrot, the great Brummie comedian, he once joked, fatalists. How come fatalists always look both way when they cross the road? because they don't want to end up as bumper fodder. That's why. Isolation said, Smith, I had no free will. Sorry, Isolation says this. I had no free will not to, so don't blame me, but then neither do you too. Lol, SMH. Smith says, you're giving the type of cringe answers religious types do when they think they have a gotcha against atheists without realising how erroneous what it is they're saying. But you were right about me not blaming you for that, but still matters. But it still matters that we try and correct it. Isolation says, you and I will do so regardless. We have no free will, remember? Maybe I should have put this into the comments reply video. I'm loving it. Smith says, nice to see you using your free will to defy your desire to reply. Proves my point, really. Isolation. I, of course, have the free will to type something. See? And TK joins in. TK says, now I have fulfilled my destiny. Smith says in reply to TK, well, if free will was doing stuff, quote unquote, then sure, by that definition, everybody has free will. To those of us in actual reality, it's more to do with why we do stuff. Keep replying though each time it proves my point, and you just can't help yourself. Isolation says to Smith, it's more about highlighting the obvious and silly aptitude you have by acting as if I have free will to do anything other than what I do in response. Why on earth are you surprised? Methinks you don't really believe what you teach about free will not existing, because you certainly don't act like it. But to admit it would really give the game away, and you aren't about to do that. You guys, Smith and Isolation, the two Davids, you have kind of gone into an area where you're repeating the points you've made before. This is very amusing. I'm enjoying reading this argument. But you're kind of like repeating points now. Repeating points now. Smith says to Isolation, that's great, Dave. When you can actually muster up some reasoned argument containing information on actual points, then perhaps you could try again. Best to leave the psychoanalyzing to the professionals, eh? Unless you really can't respond to the actual points and questions because you don't have a clue how to refute what's being said. And by thinking about it, you realise the flimsy position of your own beliefs. Da-da-da! Isolation says, I can't do that, remember? No free will, mate. TK says, why we do stuff? I think he's replying to Smith here. That's easy. We do stuff to stay alive. I'm unsure if I should reply or not now. Whichever helps your free will. That's what I'll do. Smith says to Isolation, well done, totally refuted everything I said, and neuroscientists all over the world will bow down at your amazing grasp of the subject and admit that free will clearly exists. Will you be proving God next? Smith says to TK, yeah, apart from those who commit suicide, I can promise you that the best minds on the planet don't think you can freely will away depression or other mental illnesses. So Smith saying to TK. And then I say here, thanks for your comment. It will be answered approximately within the second hour of the upcoming comments reply video. I think I was back in reply to comments 45 or something, and I didn't reply because I decided not to. And I explained to these guys I wasn't going to reply in the comments reply video because I wanted to save it. I wanted to save it for this video I'm doing now, which months later I finally managed to do, which is my third free will video. So, yeah. That's it, really. Well, thank you all of you for watching. There will be another video from me soon. As for any more free will videos, I don't know. But I think I am going to have to come back to this subject at some point, not least because there's going to be loads of comments about it and people disagreeing with me and stuff like that. But anyway, thank you very much to Claire Ray Randall, Cosmic Claire, for the article. And thank you to David Smith, David Splendid Isolation, for your comments. And for TK for his interjections every so often. Much appreciated. Thank you for watching Hapanwo TV. Hospital Porter's Pride and Dignity. Stop the New World Order.